Go. Hello, my name is Jules Evans. I am a writer and I write quite often about well-being and mental illness, including my own experiences of the varieties of health and wellness and unwellness. And I'm pleased to be joined by Amy Pollard, my friend, who is going to be telling us about how she has learned to live with and manage bipolar disorder. Amy, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
Could you start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Okay. So I'm 40. I'm director of the Mental Health Collective, which is a not-for-profit focusing on the social and collective dimensions of mental health. I trained as a social anthropologist, and I've done like all sorts of bits and bobs since then working in the not-for-profit sector. And I live in London with my 2 little girls and my husband.
And could you tell us when and how did bipolar disorder affect you?
So I've had like 3 proper big fat kind of episodes or rides on the bipolar roller coaster. One in 2006, one in 2008, and one in 2016. And then, interspersed around those times, like there's been other kind of little waves or, smaller roller coaster rides, as it were. And I think, it's the nice thing about bipolar in some senses it's a kind of iterative process. You get lots of bites of the cherry in terms of managing it. And so, I think for the last 5 years or so, especially after that kind of the last big wave, I've developed lots of kind of strategies and tools and things for managing the tides going in and out, and yeah, it's a kind of endlessly fascinating process.
And we use the phrase bipolar disorder for quite different types of experience. Is that right? That in your experience, have you had highs, kind of manic highs and depressive lows?
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind the bipolar label, but I do slightly bristle at the disordery bit, just because I think there is an orderliness. There's a different form of order, and it's more a question of tuning into what that order is like, and taking an open-minded, like curious view to it, rather than kind of thinking that the order can't possibly be there because it's less decipherable and isn't in a sort of commonly used language. To that, I mean, the broad pattern is that people get surges of energy and lots of ideas, lots of just a lot going on, like a lot kind of you might have kind of surges of like physical energy or just ideas racing or creativity or whatever. And sometimes that can kind of go a bit off the scale, like when people get really seriously unwell. And it's kind of a case of you wouldn't necessarily by yourself just get tired and then be able to slow down and stop. It's like that little bit of your kind of functioning can't just take care of itself, as it were. So historically, I know people think that people with bipolar may die by suicide or that kind of thing, which unfortunately, sadly, does happen. But historically, the most common way to die is from exhaustion and dehydration. So it's kind of the fact of not being able to stop that's the bit to worry about. And then the downside of that, of course, is that you having been so exerted, often get very tired, and that tiredness runs into a very deep kind of depression sometimes for people. And I think especially if in those periods of mania or hypomania in the psychiatric language, if there's been a sense in which you've lost connection with others or had a set of experiences that are irreconcilable with what people consider normal, then the tired period can feel very lonely, very shameful, very like the world can never, you can never re-enter the world again. And so that's where the kind of depressive bit comes in. So people, you know, in the psychiatric language, you have periods of mania followed by depression, or vice versa, basically.
Okay. Can you, if you want to, tell us a bit about what the highs are like?
I mean, obviously it's different for everybody. I don't call it high, actually, I call it whizzy. And like often it will be sort of not being able to sleep, being kept awake by thoughts, by ideas, by observations, and then like sometimes being compelled to write it down or to produce, like, you know, artwork or whatever, like produce stuff, and then I'm finding it very difficult to kind of quieten or kind of like it just kind of pours out, you know, and you can't kind of decelerate it. And then like a real sensitivity to others and to kind of the environment. So for example, becoming like really hyper aware of people's bids for attention and when they're sort of turning in on themselves and they can't handle connecting with you. So basically when those very sort of subtle cues, tacit cues of people kind of turning away or turning their attention elsewhere or whatever, and usually people read those with such subtlety that you don't, it's subconscious. But when you're whizzy, you might become like really acutely aware of someone turning away or someone coming towards you. And then that's quite unnerving in and of itself. It can like create a kind of sense of panic and a more sense of not being able to navigate like personal relationships in that normal way, and that can then create a kind of sense of loneliness and then if the other person, so what often happens is that the other person then gets nervous, and then you get this kind of anxiety vortex phenomenon whereby everybody makes each other nervous, and then the more nervous everybody gets and the higher everybody gets, that, you know, the higher the person gets, and the more the caring person wants to constrain the person who's whizzy, and then, you know, and then it gets
Yes, because I suppose one of the issues can be interpersonal relationships, like the people around the person who's whizzy or manic might be trying to control their behavior or protect them from what they see as kind of risk, and whilst the person who is high might be feeling good and like they're being kind of enhanced in their kind of thinking or performance. And so that leads to those kinds of, that can lead to a kind of clash, can't it?
It can, yeah, definitely. And, you know, I think it's it can be very challenging, I think, for loved ones to always discern like what's the right judgment, you know, when should one intervene, when should you not, what kinds, you know, and what constitutes a genuine danger and what is just a bit what's just simply unconventional, you know, and what's sort of, and how to create spaces where that can be where like steam can be let off, but in a kind of safe environment. So I that's what I would what I find very useful actually is it's kind of providing alternative channels for the energy rather than like trying to be really oppositional about it, trying to find ways for that energy to flow and be allowed and be accepted, but which doesn't, just avoid it. Like you don't need to have that it's not always required to have that kind of combative, like, and especially if people are able to interpret the impulses that might be coming up with a symbolic lens rather than just literally. I think often you can like de-escalate and like take away the dangerousness, but preserving the intent or the whatever the core of the spirit that's trying to get out, but you can still get that out, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I do. So you said you've since in the last 5 years learnt some strategies, and you talked about one there about kind of creating space for the energy to let off steam, or to have an outlet that's not so risky as maybe other ones. Just to stay on that before we look on other kind of strategies, what was an example of that? Could you give an example of, like, the last time you felt a bit wizzy? What was an outlet for that?
So I have 2 Twitter accounts. So I have like a public facing one where I'm, you know, to the extent that I'm able, like, quite, you know, publicly digestible. And then I have a second Twitter account, which is only followed by a very small group of trusted, confident, and important people in my life. And when I'm feeling a bit wizzy, I use that as a space for sort of journaling and kind of allowing whatever thoughts are coming up, and often like feelings that are coming up, I put them in that Twitter thread. I put them out on that personal private Twitter. And the thing that's good about that is, because it's Twitter, it's a stream content, right? So you're not firing off these like highly charged emails to people, which then they feel, oh my God, I've got to reply to that email. It's in the stream. So if it drifts by and someone doesn't respond, then that's fine. But people can demonstrate that they're witnessing you and they're acknowledging it. And so they might favorite it or sometimes reply. And that gives such a profound sense of accompaniment. It's such a wonderful way for me to know I haven't like burdened them. I haven't put stuff in their place, but I am allowing myself to be seen and allowing those energies to be seen.
Yes, because emails can be, you can suddenly get long emails, and as you say, think, oh, what do I do with this? Or you suddenly get CC'd in the middle of a conversation, and you're like, I don't even know what this conversation is about. And yet there is this desire to express and communicate and to connect. And so it's finding a kind of a platform for that, or a medium. And others could be like, you could have a blog maybe, or a notebook or artwork.
Yeah, absolutely, stuff like that. But I think that to have someone be witnessing you, and I sometimes even say, like, can I get a witness? And then maybe it would even at someone, and then somebody would like literally just favorite it, and I would feel witnessed. I would feel like that someone's alongside you as you do it. And the nice thing about that is it's not about like, do they understand you, or do they get you, or are they following the logic of it? No one's like scrutinizing the logic to be like, oh, does this make sense or not? Like, that's not, to be honest, that's not really the pertinent question. It's more about someone like being prepared to be alongside you, being prepared to kind of, just literally be an accompaniment. And the nice thing, and I also feel there's a safety mechanism in there. So all of the people, I call them my madness monitoring team. And my husband is the chair of the team. And if anybody's like concerned about my well-being, or they think that things have gone above a threshold which they're comfortable with or whatever, they are formally allowed and permitted to talk to one another as a team and compare notes as to whether they agree that things have crossed a certain threshold, and to go direct to my husband behind my back, so to speak, to put in place whatever safeguarding measures they think are appropriate. And I think having given that permission ahead of time, that obviously takes a leap of trust on my part, that, and I choose those people very carefully to make sure that I'm comfortable with them having that power. But it means that when I am having that outlet, they can feel safe to be subject to that material, if you see what I mean, because they're not holding it alone. Like, they're able to be amongst a little community of practice. Not that they have, they don't talk about me all the time, but they have that ability to do so if they want to.
How many people are on the Madness Monitoring Committee?
Right now, how many are we? I think six.
Okay. Yeah.
And I always allow there's always a point of contact between like whoever my line manager or my board of trustees or whatever. There's always a link in there, so that there's So basically, if there are areas where I have like significant control and responsibility in the external world, there's always a mechanism for madness monitoring people to make sure that appropriate steps can be put in place for whatever levers of power I have my hand on, as it were.
Right. Thank you. And what else have you found helpful? What other advice would you give?
I mean, I think it's very like prosaic and boring, but medication is really important. So I think there are two sets of issues with medication. I think that the most overwhelming one that people really struggle with is wanting to take it, like genuinely believing and feeling okay with taking it, and the extent of the ask that's made of people. But I would say that one of the barriers people often have to taking the medication is the sense that it's saying something about who you are or what you are, and that it means something, as it were. And I would say that the whole discipline of psychiatry is not set up to talk about meaning. It's set up for reliability. It's not set up for validity. So they know that, you know, XYZ medications can reliably have ABC impacts on people if those people have, you know, certain characteristics and are displaying certain symptoms. But they don't really know, they can't tell you that much about why, and they can't tell you that much about kind of what that all means in terms of who these people are or the nature of those experiences, etc. And I think, you know, if you can get your head around that and know that just because you take that drug doesn't mean that you are like somehow tainted yourself, or I don't know, like that it kind of has a fundamental transformative effect on like the whole of your essence as a person.
Yeah.
And so I do think that that shift is really important, and to know that psychiatry is really useful and a life-saving discipline, but don't let it over egg its pudding. It's not about changing who you are. It's just helping you like manage things in different ways. And you know, I would say, like for myself, like I've never been seriously unwell when I've been able to access my medication. And the people I know people who've died from bipolar, but I also know people who've lived for 20 years without being seriously ill. And all of the people I know in that latter category have figured out what medication they need and found a way to take it. So, you know, so basically don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Try and find a way to take your medication and find the right medication for you.
Find the right medication and find the right meaning, the right way that you make sense of it. That's your choice. That's you choose the frame, you choose the meaning and the story.
Exactly. And I think if you're able to work with a psychiatrist that you can build some kind of trust with, that can really help. And you know, for example, like I have an understanding with my psychiatrist that I can choose my dose for medication in certain circumstances. So in this, and so I cut up, I have like the smallest dose of pills that you can have, and then I can cut them up into smaller fragments. And then like when there's even the tiniest flicker of wizziness that I can kind of sense in my body and that I'm very familiar with, then I can take like the smallest possible amount that will get me down from that area. And you can learn it like wine, like, you know, I know how half a glass of wine feels in my body, and then by the same token, that you can learn how like these sort of drugs behave in terms of your mind and your body. And once you get to that point of familiarity, you can have a bigger sense of control, and you know, just bluntly, like the side effects aren't anything like as bad if you can take it in tiny little fragments that are in your control.
So in terms of your psychiatrist, do you mind if I ask, is it is it an NHS psychiatrist?
Yes.
So this is in your in the local hospital, or through a referral from the local GP?
The local secondary care team. So yeah, it's a really good thing to make sure you get. You know, the nice thing about like having a diagnosis is you are officially someone chronically with a severe and enduring mental health condition, which is like the apex of mental health conditions, and it means you get like priority boarding in terms of the psychiatric service. So you know, if you've got access to that label that allows you to access the services, I mean, bloody well take that, you know, take that boarding pass, you know.
And tell me about that relationship, because I imagine some people will only really have a relationship when they are in the moments when they're sectioned, and other than that they just get the prescription and maybe that's it. They don't have any other relationship. So was that something that you developed yourself, or that they helped you to develop? Or
I mean, yeah, like once you get, it's kind of like a ship in a bottle situation, and you know, once you're in, you kind of can't get out, is the other. So you know, you can be in a position where you spend half your time trying to access services and half your time trying to disentangle yourself from services.
right.
So you know, there is that challenge. You know, I have tried to, you know, sometimes it's a question of like holding your nose and trying to kind of work with the system as best you can. Mindful of the fact that the power dynamics are horrific in many respects, and a lot of the assumptions are quite contemptible. You know, like small tips, like for example, you can request, especially now, you know, that you have phone calls with your psychiatrist rather than going face to face, which, you know, if you've been sectioned, then physically being on property where they can close the door and keep you there, like that changes the dynamic. And obviously if you're on the phone, people can't scrutinize what you're wearing in your body to like start judging whether or not you're, you know, keeping yourself in good order or whatever. You can do things like, you know, just request that, like, say you've got to take 100 milligrams of something, make sure you're getting it in one pill that is easier to swallow than 2 pills that takes that just a little bit longer to get out of the packet and whatever, you know. So try and treat it as a service that is there to serve you rather than, you know.
And how often have do you check in with them?
Like when I can't remember really. I think there are like routine checkups like once every 6 months or 6 months or a year, I can't remember. And then you can then call them if you need them, basically. And what tends to, one really annoying thing that happens is that even if you've got repeat prescriptions for certain drugs, they time out. So you have to be careful to make sure that you can still access prescriptions when you actually need them. Because if you're well for too long, then you can't actually get the drugs when you need them again. So yeah, I would really watch.
What about things like therapy or support groups? Have either of those been helpful for you?
Oh yes, we like both of those things. Yeah, so support groups, there's the Bipolar UK have a really strong network of support groups that they operate on Zoom these days and face-to-face pre-pandemic times. And you can go along to them whether or not you've got a formal diagnosis, and you can go as a carer or family member rather than coming as like the person who's coping with conditions themselves.
And you found it helpful?
Yeah, really helpful. It's well, it's, you know, it's remarkable really, because, you know, you've got everyone's got a very distinctive experience, and, you know, there are as many types of bipolar as there are people with bipolar, right? But equally, like, there's a huge sense of commonality, and, you know, it's remarkable like how many themes that you know, come up that somebody else, you know, that just, you know, shared problems and shared experiences and things like that. And I think, you know, all the usual stuff that people say about, you know, not being alone, and, you know, having people who've coped in different ways and whatever is really helpful.
And what about therapy? What have you found helpful?
Well, I would say actually the most transformative therapeutic experience I've had hasn't been so much with a therapist, it's been with like a podcast about therapy. So I've been really moved by This Jungian Life, which is a podcast which brings together 3 Jungian analysts to talk about different topics. And the thing I like a lot about that podcast is it brings a kind of spiritual dimension to thinking about mental health, and like takes it very much into the realm of like meaning and wholeness, and a more kind of rounded and mysterious kind of arena. Whereas I think often if you get stuck in a kind of cognitive mode where you're trying to kind of trace the rationality for everything, that can kind of fight against some of the more mysterious like things that might come up when you're in a slightly more transcendent kind of state of mind. So I find that kind of works with the grain a bit better.
Right.
Not cheaper, so that's good.
Right. And other advice you might give, other tips or strategies?
I would say like agreeing things in advance. So Bipolar UK have a mood scale. So they have like a kind of traffic light thing, where, you know, if you're getting very low, these are the kinds of things that might be coming up. And then if you're getting very high, these are the kinds of things that might be coming up. And over the years, my husband and I have refined like our very own personalized one, where, you know, where we've got like an individual graduated understanding of like what might be happening for me in different areas. And we also have it for him as well, because we've recognized over the years that it's actually, if we only focus on me, then you're denying the importance of the anxiety vortex in all of this, and making and actually it's equally, if not more important, for him to have the right support than it is for myself. And that we have, and that spectrum not only has what's going on descriptions, but it also has what should we do descriptions. So we have pre-agreed you know, protocols for if this is happening, then so and so is allowed to do this, or like I will pledge to do this, if you see what I mean. And I think that that's very helpful for when you're entering into a tenser moment. You've kind of got an agreed reference point that takes some of the conflict out of that, you know.
Could you give an example of one of those things, like if this then that? Because I think it sounds so useful.
Yeah. So, for example, if we have a disagreement where my husband thinks that I should see a doctor, but I disagree, then my husband will win by default. And I will see the doctor. And we invoked that similarly. Like my husband cut his hand on a can of tuna a couple of months ago, and he didn't want to go to A&E, and I thought he should. And so I invoked our clause to say like, and it's nice, right. Like, you know, you can often find those equivalences so that you're not creating something that's like.
And you know, to what extent does hyper you listen to the advice or the instructions of level you?
I would say that, I mean, it depends, obviously, at the extent of the levels, so to speak. Yeah. And I would, you know, I've worked quite rigorously over the years in terms of developing a kind of rich and genuine relationship with the parts of myself that come through in those whizzier kind of moments, and kind of valuing and honoring those voices rather than flipping them off and trying to repress and suppress and like make them go away. And because basically the messages that come up and come through, like through those voices that come in the night, or, you know, the ideas that are coming in the night, they will come anyway. They will come. All you can do is kind of slow them down and like soften the unconventionalness of them. But there's the best thing to do is to try and build a try and genuinely understand what's trying to come up, and then build a relationship with that part of you rather than try and cut it off or kill it in some ways.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Does that make sense?
It does. It was beautifully put. What advice would you give to loved ones of people with some of this kind of stuff coming up?
I think like first of all, like to say thank you to them, you know, for sticking with me and my brethren, you know, and like accompanying us on we, you know, I know it's a very difficult journey. So, you know, I think that's I do want to stress, like, you know, thank you, because I know it's incredibly hard. I would say don't underestimate the value of simply keeping your feet on the ground and helping someone else like come be down to earth and like be earthed in that way. And I think you know, humility, like people talk a lot about inflation and, you know, someone having inflated ideas, and of course inflation is, it's just an in-breath, right? It's just we're not supposed to be completely flat, we're supposed to breathe in and out as human beings. And I think like not being too scared of that, just being like, it's an in-breath, it's an out-breath. It's often quite funny, it's often quite
Right.
You can allow it to be.
So managing our fear of the unusual in a way.
And you know, the simple things like try and make sure that they're eating or make food available so they can be, so that they, you know, can be eating, reminding to eat, like set some little alarms to make sure to make it easy to remember to eat, like, you know, do your best to help people sleep, physically make it easier to make contact with the earth, so go gardening and go for a walk and touch stuff, like hold people's hands, like literally hold their hands, because you won't necessarily be able to accompany them in their heads, but you can accompany in your body, and to just literally sit with people, like sit alongside people, like physically alongside rather than in an oppositional framing.
Right. And you said your you know, things that your husband does to take care of himself as well. So tell me about that. I mean, tell me a bit more, because I think it's something you know, I think it's important as well, isn't it? Like the kind of the carers self-care, or the carers is the wrong word, partners self-care and so on.
Yeah. Well, I guess he'd obviously be better to tell you himself. But I mean, he's got lots of kind of interests of his own, you know, so Arsenal are quite an important part of his like self-care package.
It's the strangest self-care method I've ever heard as a fellow Arsenal supporter. But anyway, okay, I get it. So he's got his own interests.
You know, there's something that it's absorbing, isn't it? And it's
and it's separate as well. It's like
it's absorbing, it's separate, and you know, having his own friends and his own like reference group and his own parents as well. You know, we were fortunate, like he and I, we've known each other since we were children. We grew up next door to each other. And he saw me being acutely unwell before we even got together, like so when we were in our 20s. And so did his family as well. So, you know, he always had that kind of frame of reference, and so did they, like when we were getting together. And I think that definitely helps. And I think, you know, in that mode, it's that sort of stepping back and being able to see someone as a whole person rather than getting too kind of up in them like a diagnosis, you know, and allowing that to frame how you see them. And I think, like trying to see seeing where someone's coming from, like in the round, rather than just sort of trying to literally to unpick like a particular thread that they're intently pursuing.
Absolutely.
But,
and we talked earlier about you choose the story, you choose the meaning of your medication and of relating to these parts of you. Though, as I said that, I thought, well, that's, of course, we're always in a negotiation with the people around us and with our society, and they
Yeah.
will also have their own story and frame and so on. What's that been like in terms of, you know, society, other people, employers, or just that kind of thing? I mean, yeah, just tell me about that. I know that's a broad question, but
Mm,
take it where you want.
yeah. I mean, it's quite annoying, obviously. It's
Hmm.
quite yeah, it's sad. It's sad and lonely um to be confronted by the lack of understanding and
And is that what happens? Do you get confronted by a lack of understanding?
well, I mean, usually not so. You usually overhear it more than you get confronted by it, I would say. So I think, you know, when I'm like operating in the world, generally, like I'm able to, you know, control what how I'm presenting, and therefore kind of, you know, engage with people in a way that they can relate to, and you know, you don't kind of get it. But I certainly you hear people talking when they think you're not there with a bipolar hat on, and you see how it's how it's perceived. And you know, and I
Mm,
see lots of um lots of my people like being on the street not being very well, and how they're treated, and how poorly people engage
yeah,
um in the general public with people um who are like in psychosis, or who aren't sharing the same like plane of reality that other people have around them. Like you see how dehumanized that people think it's okay to be, and
yeah,
how unimaginative people are in terms of their modes of engagement. So that's obviously very like sad and upsetting.
yeah, yeah,
But like, you know, honestly, like I think, I mean, people always say this, don't they? But I do think that it's largely born of fear, and of particularly like fear of death, and fear of um, you know, the mystery that people with
yeah.
bipolar.
And it's also, I think, um, what am I trying to say? Like social conventions keep fear at bay, fear
Hmm,
of like the unknown, fear of awkwardness, fear of like, who am I and how am I meant to behave? So when someone doesn't obey social conventions, it's like a glitch in the matrix, and,
yeah.
and the culture goes, you know, stop that, stop that, follow the rules, you know,
Mhm.
follow conventions. So yeah, it's that kind of thing, you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I, you know, I don't sort of feel the need to like charge around London, like shouting salmon, trout, fish cakes at the top of my voice.
Yeah,
Like, I don't know, that sort of like,
yeah,
if it's, I don't, you know, I don't think sort of unconventionalness is necessarily like, it's necessarily good in and of itself per se. But I do think
yeah,
if we were able to respond to it with a bit more curiosity and a bit more
yeah,
mindedness, and to like just to be a bit more discerning, basically, without so not to kind of dismiss lack of convention out of hand
right.
just because it's jarring. Um,
Yeah, yeah. Okay,
uh,
yeah.
you know,
Do
I
you
mean,
think
this might
it's
be funny on my part, but
do you think it's changing? I mean, cultures, of course, people are going to be watching this from different cultures, and it'll be a very different story in India versus Canada or so on. But in your culture, in the UK, um, are people's attitudes changing?
I mean, honestly, I would it people would like to think, I'm sure, that, you know, with the huge surge in tolerance around mental health difficulties over the last 10 years or so, that, you know, people were becoming more positive, I get an open-minded and whatever. And I think that is true to a certain extent. There's also, but there's very much a dynamic whereby, you know, if you've got anxiety, depression, the more frequently occurring mental health conditions, people are much more able to kind of get on board with them. And I think that
because they're less socially disturbing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to diminish those, you know, how crippling they are for people, but you know, if the stuff
they're less visible.
Yeah, you can cover for them more easily, right?
Yeah.
But I think, and there has been some progress, I suppose, in terms of like severe and enduring mental illness, less being associated with like axe wielding. So, for example, you know, when we did I was involved in the review of the Mental Health Act legislation, like the stuff that guards you when you're, you know, that defines how you're going to be sectioned if you're very, very seriously ill. And the emphasis within that was less on, you know, how dangerous everybody was than how, you know, people in psychosis were going to murder everybody, and more on like, you know, the dignity of and respect that needs to be shown to people when they're very unwell. And I guess, you know, even having that agenda on the table is very positive. So I guess, you know, I shouldn't be too like churlish about it, but equally, I do think there's quite a long way to go. I think, I'm afraid, there's
we
really
feel earlier in the process with psychosis than we are with relating to things like anxiety and depression. We feel more nearer the kind of start of that journey.
I think so, yeah. And I think, you know, I think that there are some pretty deeply rooted cultural norms and values that mediate against us being able to make strong progress along. But, you know, culture's always changing, it's always fluid. So, you know, I'm certainly not, and there's very much a pathway, you know, even despite all of those obstacles, there's very much a pathway for life, like in, you know, living in these conditions and with this kind of diagnosis.
So the last two questions, Amy. The first is, and don't spend too long on this because it might be too big a question. Is it important to you to ask, and do you ask, like, why did this happen? Like, what caused it? Was this because of, you know, events in my life? Was this caused because of genes? Is that something that to you is important to ask, or no?
It's been especially interesting to me, like to try and track that back. I can't say that that's like been something I've spent a lot of time on. It's probably just a mixture, isn't it? Like everything.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And then just last one is, like, how today do you relate to this? What kind of, we talked about this a bit, but what kind of frame or perspective do you do? How do you think of it?
So I like to use, in my own mind, like the metaphor of forging iron into steel, basically. So, you know, the process where you get a lump of iron and then you heat it up, and then it gets hotter and hotter and hotter, and then it gets kind of sharp and so hot you can barely look at it, and then you plunge it into the water, and then you keep on doing that again and again and again, and that's how you make the steel. Like, I think that when you're in periods of heating up and getting whizzier, and then you plunge into those like icy waters of depression earlier, it's quite helpful to have that image in mind and that forward-looking trajectory of knowing that, like, that is the process whereby steel is made, and that after every wave and every iteration of, you know, these like psychic tides going in and out, like it's always the case that I learn more and I get more whole and I get more strong, and, you know, there's a real there's a real sense of being part of something special, I would say, in carrying this condition.
So you didn't relate to these parts of you as like bad parts of you, as like disorders, broken bits, things like that. It's more, there's a kind of a growing relationship to them.
Definitely.
And a growing coming to terms with them, and ability to relate to them and kind of dance with them even.
Yeah, not coming to terms as in, oh, you've got to get dragged down by them. More coming to terms as in, here are some terms, like some terminology that we can agree on, which allows us to talk to one another. It's more that.
Yeah.
So yeah, and if I look back kind of compassionately at all the different material that's come up in my various kind of waves of illness, like there is a coherent kind of body of work that arises, and it may not always have been expressed in a very sensible way or in a way that's intelligible to others, but there's something that's I'm curious as to what it is, and so I want to hear more.
And so now you have learned to manage it with strategies, including with medication, with this great system you worked out with your husband. And so what remains of this aspect of your personality? In some ways, in a kind of cohabitable form. Do you still get kind of times of creativity, and then times of like quieter times and so on?
Yeah, definitely. But it's very much in that as you just described it is the way that I would say, it's moments of creative like productivity, and then like periods of quiet and fatigue and energy coming in and out, basically. But I've what I'd be interested to do is get to a point where, instead of like those waves crashing on my back and me like finding a way to surf them, when they come along, to get to a point, like, wouldn't it be amazing if I had the power or had some agency to kind of call that energy when I wanted it, or like when it seemed pertinent, So yeah, instead of finding a way to like deal with it when it arose, but to have some way of and to have a level of confidence in my ability to manage it, that I could bring it forward when it felt like a solution to a problem, like it was practical and appropriate for it to arise.
That sounds like magic.
Right, wouldn't it be magic?
To be the ability to summon spirits.
Yeah, exactly.
Or to summon forces.
Yeah. But I mean, but with that, how do you do that? And like, even as I say that now, it sounds really inflated and dangerous.
I don't know. I suppose that's to some extent what maybe artists do, and scientists and coders and shamans, and they will sometimes tactically use different types of consciousness for different purposes, but they'll know how to put themselves back together. So I guess we are still learning about it. And anyway, you've talked about this so beautifully and articulately, and so on behalf of everyone watching this as well, and coming to terms with this, and learning to dance with it, and learning to kind of sharpen their steel. Thank you very much, Amy. Really appreciate your time.
Pleasure.